The morning Harold Sutton won his appeal, he was thinking about stake. Not justice. Not the 3 years of litigation that had nearly bankrupted his firm. Not the opposing counsel's face when the judge read the verdict aloud in that particular tone. Flat and final, the way only superior court judges in Ottawa can manage. He was thinking about the ribeye at Becta, whether he should call ahead, whether a table for 6 would be enough, or if he should book the private room in the back. He had earned this. 63 years old, built from nothing in Sudbury, Ontario, 2 failed businesses before the third one held, Sutton Environmental Consulting, which had grown quietly and without fanfare into one of the most respected firms in the country. He did not like attention. He had never liked attention. He liked good wine, competent people, and silence in the mornings. What he did not like was being accused of regulatory fraud by a competitor who had fabricated internal documents and convinced a junior official at Environment Canada to sign off on a complaint that had no business existing. But it was over now. It was over, and the sun was doing something generous to the stone steps of the courthouse, and the city smelled like April, cold still, but with that particular Canadian optimism underneath, that quiet sense that the worst had passed. His driver, a composed man named Neil, was already pulling the black Escalade toward the curb. His associate Preethi was beside him, talking on her phone, gesturing at nothing. His junior partner, Rolf Anderson, was scrolling through something and smiling. Behind them, his lawyer of 12 years, Gavin Chow, was shaking hands with the other members of the legal team. Harold started down the steps. He was 3 steps from the bottom when a small hand closed around the sleeve of his coat. He stopped. He looked down. The girl could not have been older than 6. Maybe 7, but small for it if so. She was wearing a gray parka that was 2 sizes too large. The hood pushed back, her dark braids slightly unraveled at the ends as though she had slept in them. Her boots did not match. One had a Velcro strap, one had laces. She was looking up at him with an expression he would later struggle to describe. Not fear exactly. Something more deliberate than fear, something focused. "Sir," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I need to tell you something about your car." Harold glanced toward the Escalade. Neil was standing outside it, door half open, waiting. "That's very kind," Harold said, not unkindly. He had a granddaughter roughly this age. He knew how to speak to children without making them feel small. "Are you here with your family, sweetheart? My grandpa is inside." She pointed back at the courthouse without looking away from him. He has to wait for his name. "But I saw something. Under your car. When it was parked," she swallowed. "A man. He was under there for a long time," Harold paused. "Under the car," he repeated. "He had a red bag. Small. He put it on the underside. I thought he dropped something and was picking it up, but then he left and didn't take it. He just walked away fast. He had a green jacket, dark green, and a scratch on the back of his hand here." She touched the back of her own small hand, just below the knuckle. "I couldn't see his face properly, but he had a beard. Not a lot, just a little one." She said all of this very carefully, the way children do when they are trying very hard to be believed. Harold stood completely still on the courthouse steps. He had spent 3 years being lied to, manipulated, and exhausted by people who spoke with great confidence and perfect grammar. And now this child, with her mismatched boots and her unraveled braids, was telling him something in the plainest possible language, and everything in him that had survived 3 decades in the corporate world said, "Listen to her." He turned back toward the building instead of the car. "Preethi," he said, in a voice that carried without being loud. "Call security. Do not let anyone approach that vehicle." She's looked up from her phone. He crouched down in front of the girl, getting to her level, because that was the right thing to do, and Harold Sutton had always known what the right thing was, even when it inconvenienced him. "What's your name?" he asked. "B," she said. "Beatrice. But everyone calls me B. B. My name is Harold. Can you tell me? The man you saw. What time was this?" She thought about it. "Before the big bell. The one that goes when it's so before 11 o'clock. "I think so. Grandpa and me got here at 10. It wasn't long after, and the red bag. Can you tell me more about it? Shape, size?" She held her hands apart, approximately the size of a hardcover book. Like a lunchbox, but not a lunchbox, more flat. It had something stuck to it. Like a clip. He pressed the clip onto the metal. Harold stood. Gavin was already beside him, and Harold said one sentence, and Gavin's expression shifted in a way that 12 years of partnership had taught Harold to read. "This is serious." The Ottawa police arrived in 11 minutes. The courthouse had its own security detail, and 2 officers were there in 4, roping off the Escalade while Harold and his team stood to one side. A 3rd officer knelt beside the girl with a notepad and asked her the same questions Harold had asked, and then several more. She answered each one patiently, with the same careful precision. The green jacket, the dark beard, the scratch, the way he had walked, fast but not running, like he didn't want to look fast. The bomb squad was called. Harold watched from the courthouse steps. Preeti had one hand over her mouth. Rolf had gone very pale. Gavin was on the phone with someone, talking quietly and steadily in the way he did when he was managing something he did not entirely understand. The device was real. It was confirmed in the kind of official, understated language that makes terrible things feel briefly bureaucratic. A device consistent with an improvised explosive, affixed to the undercarriage, partial detonation capability. One of the officers said it quietly to a colleague. Harold heard it anyway because he had always had very good hearing, which was, he had long believed, at least 60% of what made him good at his job. He sat down on the courthouse steps. Not because his legs had given out. They had not. Harold Sutton did not have the kind of legs that gave out. He sat down because sitting felt like the appropriate response to the information that he had been 45 seconds and 20 feet from getting into a car that someone had wanted to kill him in. Bea was sitting beside him, unprompted, her small boots dangling off the edge of the step. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "Are you?" She considered this the way children consider things when they take questions seriously. "A little hungry," she said finally. He laughed. It surprised him, the way it came out, genuine and sudden. "I think that's a very reasonable thing to be," he said. The officer who had taken Bea's statement came back to speak to Harold. They would need a full account of everyone who had known about his court appearance, the location, the vehicle. This was not a random act. Devices of this type required foreknowledge, planning, time. Whoever had done this had known which car was his, where it would be parked, and approximately how long the hearing would last. That was a short list of people. Harold knew it before the officer finished the sentence. He sat there on the courthouse steps in the April sunlight, the city humming its ordinary Friday morning around him, and he thought through the list, and when he got to one particular name, something cold and final settled in his chest. Calvin Merritt, his operations manager. 18 years. Harold had hired him when Sutton Environmental was still operating out of a rented office in Nepean with 4 employees and a fax machine. He had promoted him twice, trusted him with client relationships that had taken a decade to build, given him equity in the firm when the good years came. He had attended Calvin's father's funeral. He had given a toast at his wedding. He had also, 6 weeks ago, begun to suspect that Calvin had been feeding proprietary information to the same competitor who had triggered the regulatory complaint. The complaint that had just failed. The complaint that had cost that competitor 3 years and what Harold estimated was approximately $2.5 million in legal fees. He had not confronted Calvin. He had been gathering evidence quietly with Gavin's help. Being certain before speaking, that was Harold's way. He had been 3 days from being certain. He did not say any of this to the officer. Not yet. What he said was, "I'd like my lawyer present when we have this conversation." The officer nodded. That, inside the courthouse, a grandfather was waiting for his granddaughter to come back. Harold asked one of the security officers to go in and find him, explain what had happened, and make sure he was comfortable. The officer did. He came back out 10 minutes later with a man in his mid-70s, moving slowly with a cane, wearing a brown corduroy jacket that had been through many winters. His name was Edouard Beaumont. He was from Gatineau. He had taken the bus this morning, and he had a custody hearing in 40 minutes regarding his ability to continue providing care for Beatrice, his granddaughter, following the death of her mother the previous year. Harold stood to greet him. Edouard looked at him, then at Bea, then back at him, with the particular expression of a man who is trying to hold many things together at once. "She told you something," he said. "About the car." "She did," Harold said. "She may have saved my life." Edouard looked at Bea for a long moment. She was sitting on the step eating a granola bar that Preeti had produced from somewhere. She did not look up. "She notices things," Edouard said. It came out softly, the way people say things they have had to learn to be grateful for after a long time being frightened by them. Always has, since she was very small. Her mother used to say she had eyes in the back of her head, but it wasn't that. It was, she watches everything. "She is remarkable," Harold said, and he meant it without ceremony. Edouard's hearing was at 1:30. The question before the court was whether he had the physical and financial means to continue caring for Beatrice, given his age, his health, and his limited pension. The child welfare officer assigned to the file had recommended a review. There was a possibility, outlined in formal language in several official documents, that Beatrice would be placed with a foster family while the situation was assessed. Harold did not ask for any of this information. Gavin, who had an instinct for these things, had spoken briefly with the courthouse clerk and come back with a summary. Harold processed it the way he processed most difficult information, in silence, standing still, looking at something that was not the thing he was thinking about. "Mr. Beaumont," he said, when Edouard returned from the water fountain. "I wonder if you might allow me to do something." Edouard looked at him with the careful eyes of a man who had learned not to accept things too quickly. "That depends on what it is," he said. "It's nothing dramatic," Harold said. "I simply think that if your granddaughter's welfare is being assessed partly on financial grounds, and if I am in a position to provide some documentation that might be relevant to that assessment, it would be wasteful not to do so." Edouard was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't need charity," he said. Not angry, just clear. "No," Harold said. "She doesn't. This isn't charity. This is an old man who would have been killed this morning, settling an account that can never actually be settled, and doing the closest thing to it that is within his power." Edouard was quiet for longer this time. "Let me think about it," he said. "Of course," Harold said, inside the Escalade, which would not be driven anywhere today, and possibly ever again. Harold's phone was ringing with a call he would not take until later. It was Calvin Merritt. The police, who had already begun their work, would later determine that Calvin had been in contact with personnel connected to the competing firm for 14 months. He had provided client lists, methodology reports, internal cost structures. When the regulatory complaint had failed, and when he had understood that Harold's suspicion was closing in, he had arranged, through 2 degrees of removal, for a man with a green jacket and a small beard and a scratch on his hand to visit the courthouse parking area on a Friday morning in April. Calvin had not done the thing himself. People like Calvin rarely did. But the chain of decisions led back to him clearly enough that the Crown Attorney's office, when they eventually received the file, did not have a great deal of work to do. Harold learned most of this over the following 2 weeks. He learned it in pieces, the way these things arrive. A call from the investigator, an email from Gavin, a brief item in the Ottawa Citizen that described a local businessman cooperating with authorities in connection with an ongoing investigation. He read the Citizen piece on a Tuesday morning in his kitchen in Rockcliffe Park, standing at the counter with his coffee, and he felt, not triumph. He was not a man who felt triumph. He felt something closer to relief, and beneath it, a quiet grief, because 18 years is a long time, and waste is its own kind of sadness. He had also, by that point, learned more about Beatrice Beaumont, 7 years old, as it turned out, small for her age, as he had guessed. She had been living with her grandfather Edouard in Gatineau since the previous September, when her mother Sylvette had died unexpectedly of a cardiac event at 34. Her father had not been in the picture for several years. Edouard had stepped in without hesitation, reorganizing his retirement, converting his small office into a bedroom, learning which cartoons she liked and which ones frightened her, and how she took her cereal. He had a heart condition of his own. Managed, but present. And his pension, after a long career with the federal government in a mid-level administrative role, was adequate, but not comfortable. The custody review had been triggered by a routine welfare check, and the system had done what systems do. It had measured Edouard against a set of criteria and found him wanting in 2 of the 4 categories. The hearing on that Friday had gone better than Edouard had expected. The judge had asked several questions about continuity of care, about the child's adjustment, about support structures. And then, in the middle of the hearing, a letter had been delivered by a court officer, a formal letter, on the letterhead of Sutton Environmental Consulting, signed by Harold Sutton himself, describing a trust established in the name of Beatrice Ann Beaumont, sufficient to cover her educational expenses through university, managed independently, requiring no action or acceptance from Edouard beyond his awareness of its existence. Edouard had not looked at Harold, who was not in the courtroom. Harold had not wanted him to. The judge had taken the letter into consideration, along with a character assessment provided by Bea's teacher, and 2 neighbors and the school counselor and the social worker who had initially triggered the review and who had since revised her position. Edouard was granted continued custody. No further review was scheduled unless circumstances changed materially. Harold heard this from Gavin on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the courthouse steps. He was in his office, which looked out over the Rideau River, still carrying the last gray of the ice in its edges, though the trees were beginning to fill in. He said, "Good." He meant it, the way he meant most things, completely, and without needing to elaborate. He visited Edouard's home in Gatineau once, 6 weeks later. He had not intended to make a habit of it. He had brought nothing, because he had decided that bringing things was beside the point, and Harold was a man who understood points. He sat at Edward's kitchen table and drank tea that was too strong, and ate a slice of a lemon pound cake that Edward had apparently made himself, which was, Harold reflected, deeply impressive, and the 2 of them talked for an hour and a half about nothing in particular. The construction on the Champlain Bridge, whether the senators had any real hope of a turnaround, what retirement actually felt like versus what you expected it to feel like. Bea was doing homework at the other end of the table. At one point, she looked up and regarded Harold with the same focused, deliberate expression she had turned on him at the courthouse. "You have a crumb," she said, "on your tie." He looked down. He did. "Thank you," he said. She returned to her homework. Edward caught Harold's eye across the table, and there was something in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape a smile makes in a face that has been through too much to manage a full one, easily. Pride, maybe. Recognition. The particular exhausted love of a person who has committed to another person knowing it will ask everything of them. Harold drove back across the river in the early evening, the city settling into its quiet Friday version of itself, the light, flat, and generous on the water. He had lived in Ottawa for 30 years and had never lived anywhere else since leaving Sudbury, and he felt, in the way he sometimes felt things at the end of a long week, that the city was familiar to him in the way that only places you have suffered in can become familiar. He thought about the morning in April on the courthouse steps. He thought about being 3 steps from the bottom, and a small hand on his sleeve, and a child's voice saying, "I need to tell you something about your car." He thought about how easy it would have been not to stop. He was always moving toward the next thing, the car, the restaurant, the table for 6, the celebration of something that had cost him too much to celebrate lightly. He was always carrying the forward momentum of a man who had trained himself off never to stop moving, because stopping had once, a long time ago, meant failure, and failure had meant starting over, and starting over had cost him in ways that still occasionally surfaced in the middle of the night. He had stopped. He still wasn't entirely sure why. Some instinct, some quality of her voice, some 30-year accumulation of reading rooms and situations, and the infinitesimally small signals that told you when something was true. But he had stopped. And that was the thing. He parked in his driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The Rideau River was not visible from here, but he knew it was there, carrying its spring water south, past the old stone buildings and the embassies and the quiet residential streets of this city that had held his life in it for 3 decades. He thought about Edouard Beaumont in Gatineau, making lemon pound cake, learning cartoons, reorganizing his retirement around a child with mismatched boots and very serious eyes. The smallest things, Harold thought. Not the verdict, not the 3 years of litigation or the vindication or the stake at Becta that he had finally had, 2 days after the courthouse, and which had been excellent. Not any of the large, visible things he had built and fought for. The smallest thing. A child who watched. A man who stopped. He got out of the car and went inside.